How could the absolute greatest empire of our ancient world be reduced to a forgotten, irrelevant wasteland within just one single, terrifying generation? We have all heard tales of Egypt's unimaginable glory and endless gold. Yet few among us know the precise, terrifying reason this mighty kingdom stopped growing, retreating into isolation and fear. My people thought it was merely a lost battle, but the chilling truth is, it was a brutal collection of debts. Together, you and I will uncover that forgotten invasion, a slaughter meant only to pay the wages of an enemy army. And the dark economic truth that forever doomed the pharaohs. I stand shivering on the banks of the Euphrates. The heat makes the air violently tremble, and dust chokes our horizon. It is the year 605 before Christ. You might see only modern borders now, but to my terrified ancestors, this bleeding strip of earth was known solely as the throat of the world. Whoever held those dusty roads controlled not just our faith, but the wealth. It was the only bridge connecting Africa, Asia, and distant Europe, to trade our wheat, gold, or spices. We had to cross it, paying heavy taxes to our oppressors. The cunning Egyptians knew this well. Pharaoh Necho II, a fiercely ambitious strategist, moved his deadly pieces years before. He marched his massive army northward. He slaughtered our King Josiah at Megiddo, a tragedy weeping through the second book of Kings, violently turning our tiny kingdom into a helpless vassal state. My people now paid rent just to breathe, swearing forced loyalty to Egypt. For the pharaohs, everything felt perfectly settled. They firmly held the bridge, the silver flowed freely, and Assyria, our old tormentor, lay in bleeding ruins. But the prideful pharaoh ignored the darkening northern skies. Across the cursed river, a terrifying new storm of iron was gathering. It was no established king leading those Babylonian hordes, but a fierce crown prince, young and desperate to prove himself. His dreaded name was Nebuchadnezzar. Their ancient clay chronicles, unearthed from the dirt, record our doom day by day. They describe an aggressively swift, terrifyingly massive military mobilization. Nebuchadnezzar did not come to negotiate borders. He came to consume absolutely everything. My people of Judah faced total despair. We in Jerusalem foolishly looked to Egypt, praying that strong older brother would somehow protect us. We blindly believed that as long as we paid Pharaoh, our high walls would save us. But Necho II made a fatal, arrogant miscalculation. He assumed the vast distance would protect his men, thinking Babylon needed months to organize. So in his pride, he parked his forces in fortified Carchemish and waited. He foolishly trusted his mere reputation would terrify any challenger away. He did not know Nebuchadnezzar marched with terrifying, unnatural speed. This violent collision between our ancient world's two massive powers would not be a fair fight. It would be a bloody reckoning, shattering our world's borders forever. Stay with me. You and I will witness what truly happened when these mighty armies clashed. Leaving absolutely no Egyptian soul alive to speak, you will soon understand how. A bloody stalemate pushed my beloved Judah into committing the most devastating error of our existence. And finally, my friend, we will uncover the secret invasion of Egypt, a hidden nightmare only recently confirmed by a shattered, weeping clay tablet. The slaughter did not last days but mere hours, as Babylon crossed the Euphrates. The Egyptian infantry was violently wiped from existence. The prophet Jeremiah describes this very moment in chapter 46 as a day of divine vengeance. A day the sword devoured until entirely drunk. But what the ruthless Babylonian chronicles, known as a BC5, reveal is far more horrifying. The cold cuneiform script explicitly declares that absolutely no man escaped. Those poor Egyptian soldiers, who somehow survived the initial agonizing bloodbath, desperately fled toward the region of Hamath. but the monster Nebuchadnezzar hunted them down, ensuring not one single, terrified soul survived to return home. Our ancient world watched in absolute terror. In one single afternoon, the mighty superpower that commanded us for centuries simply evaporated into blood. The dusty road south, cutting straight through Syria down to our vulnerable gates of Jerusalem, was now violently torn wide open. For our local kings, this meant pure panic. Our great protector was dead. Babylon now owned our broken lands, and they would brutally extract our absolute loyalty. Nebuchadnezzar stood ready to march south, forging his dark empire by burning city after city. But at the peak of his slaughter, in August of 605 before Christ, a dust-covered messenger rode into camp. He carried urgent, desperate news. His powerful father, King Nabopolassar, had suddenly died. This revelation changed our destiny. In cutthroat Babylonian politics, an empty throne was an open invitation for vicious usurpers and traitors. If he stayed near our borders celebrating his bloody victory, would he lose his crown? He faced an impossible, agonizing choice. Did he seek to conquer our lands or merely secure his crown? His choice was swift. He handed his vast armies, trembling captives like us, and heavy spoils of war to his generals, commanding them down the safe, slow road. Meanwhile, he mounted his steed. With a tiny, fierce escort, he tore straight through the scorching, unforgiving desert sands. It was a grueling 800-kilometer sprint in merely 23 days, an impossible, terrifying speed for that ancient age. He reached Babylon just in time to grasp the stone hand of his god Marduk and be crowned sovereign, seizing absolute power. This frantic rush saved his dark throne, yet it came with a heavy, bloody cost abroad. By abandoning that vicious military campaign halfway through just to hurry back home, Nebuchadnezzar left our sacred promised land conquered on fragile parchment, yet completely untamed and restless in actual breathing practice. I watched our king of Judah and neighboring lords see the tyrants retreating back. We breathed a fragile sigh, foolishly believing the worst nightmare had finally passed. We blindly interpreted that cunning tactical retreat as pure weakness or disinterest. And it was exactly that tragic, desperate misreading of the shadows that planted the bitter seeds for the absolute ruin soon to follow us. The Babylonian king had left, but he would return. Only next time, he would meet a fierce resistance he never expected, making his invincible army bleed. 4 long years passed since that rushed coronation. By November 601 BC, Babylon decided to stop creeping around our quiet borders. They were ready to violently kick down the front doors. Nebuchadnezzar marched relentlessly south. He didn't come just to terrorize the small towns of Judah or Phoenicia, but to brutally invade Egypt itself. His dark plan was chillingly simple: crush Pharaoh Necho in his own grand house, ending this global imperial rivalry once and for all. But holy war rarely follows human scripts. The massive Egyptian army was no longer fleeing in blind, chaotic panic like during their last battle. This time, they were deeply entrenched at the border, ready to die defending their lands. The terrifying clash between those two forces was brutal. The Babylonian Chronicle recording that bloody year is shockingly honest for an official ancient document that typically only boasts of glorious victories. That clay cuneiform text reveals both sides fought in horrific hand-to-hand combat, inflicting massive, devastating losses upon each other. There was no victory parade. Nebuchadnezzar stared out over a scarred battlefield choked with rotting bodies, saw his shattered war chariots, and did the completely unthinkable. He commanded a retreat. The invincible army limped home, empty-handed, stripped of all their plunder and devoid of any glory. To my people watching from Jerusalem's high walls, that retreat felt like a divine sign. King Jehoiakim, who ruled us in Judah as a captive Babylonian vassal for 3 years, watched the giant bleed. Then he made the most deadly, reckless calculation in our history. In his deluded mind, he truly believed the ultimate power had changed hands again. He thought if Egypt could stall Babylon, we were finally safe to run back into Pharaoh's arms. Jehoiakim stopped paying our crushing tributes. He severed the heavy flow of gold, silver, and precious grain that kept Babylon away from our fragile gates. It was a terrifying, desperate gamble, gambling our lives on Nebuchadnezzar being finished. But our doomed King Jehoiakim couldn't read the dark, hidden war diaries of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's retreat wasn't a surrender. I know now it was a calculated, silent pause. Ancient records show he spent the entire following year, 600 BC, completely halting his military campaigns. He stayed inside his palace, not resting, but relentlessly rebuilding his dark forces. The chronicle clearly details the massive production of fresh war chariots, aggressive lie recruiting thousands of war horses and ruthless soldiers to replace every single fallen man, while my blinded Jerusalem celebrated false freedom. The furious king of Babylon was forging his bitter humiliation into a renewed, unimaginably lethal war machine. That eerie silence creeping from the north wasn't peace. It was the terrifying whisper of iron swords, being sharpened for a very specific bloody revenge. And when that monstrous new army finally marched, they weren't heading toward Egypt. He locked his furious gaze on a new primary target, the king who dared betray him. Pure vengeance arrived at my beloved Jerusalem's gates in early 597 BC, but the grim political landscape had already shifted dramatically beneath us. Our stubborn King Jehoiakim, who dragged us into this nightmare by refusing Babylonian taxes, died just before the invaders arrived. He left his cursed crown and our impending doom to his 18-year-old son, Jehoiachin. I stood beside the trembling young king on those high stone walls, staring at the empty horizon, desperately praying to see Egyptian rescue banners. But the dusty road stretching south was completely empty. Pharaoh Necho II had learned a brutal lesson from their last clash. He ultimately decided shedding more Egyptian blood wasn't worth saving our isolated mountain city. We were abandoned. Judah stood completely alone. What happened to my people next is one of the most chillingly documented tragedies in all ancient history. We don't just rely on the holy biblical scrolls of Kings or Chronicles for the details. Deep inside the British Museum sits a clay tablet marked BM 21946, a cold, official receipt of our utter devastation. Have you ever watched your world collapse? The cuneiform clay records the exact date our city fell, the 2nd day of Adar. King Nebuchadnezzar did not even need to smash our walls. Our young King Jehoiachin realized the promised Egyptian rescue was a bitter lie. To spare us from a bloody massacre, he simply opened the massive gates and surrendered. The Babylonian king marched in, but instead of burning our homes, he severed the intellectual head of our society. He knew that controlling a rebellious people meant far more than just replacing a king. He had to strip away our ability to think and fight, ordering the exile of Jerusalem's brightest. I watched in tears as long chains of prisoners vanished. Skilled weaponsmiths, our bravest trained soldiers, gifted artisans, and the high nobility. In that very wave of captives, holy men like the prophet Ezekiel were dragged away to Babylon. I was left behind with the poor peasants in Judah. To him, we were broken nobodies, stripped of the resources and leadership needed to ever spark another uprising. To manage the shattered remains of our kingdom, Nebuchadnezzar chose our exiled ruler's uncle, a man named Mattaniah, and renamed him Zedekiah. He placed him on the throne with one demand: swear absolute loyalty to Babylon in the holy name of the God of Israel. Zedekiah was meant to be nothing but a weak puppet, managing the peace and keeping the tribute flowing. It seemed like the perfect peace plan. But inside these ancient walls, the surviving nobles refused to accept our defeat. They just saw a fragile, cowardly king who could easily be twisted to their will. Our king swore his obedience. Yet the toxic pressure to shatter that sacred vow began the very day the Babylonian armies marched away. We were not destined for peace, but for a far more devastating betrayal. Down south in Egypt, a sudden shift in power became the spark that lit our doom. The old pharaoh Necho passed away, and the aggressive Apries known in the scriptures as Hophra took control. Unlike his predecessor, who had painfully learned to fear Babylonian power, Apries was bold and deeply hungry to reclaim the entire Levant. He sneaked foreign ambassadors into Jerusalem, offering a dangerous temptation. If Zedekiah withheld the heavy tribute from Nebuchadnezzar, Egypt promised their vast army and naval fleet would fight for Judah's freedom. Inside the holy city, this false hope split our leaders into two bitter factions, trapping us in a confusing war of words. On one side stood the prophet Jeremiah, who spoke hard truths like a grim political realist. He wandered our dusty streets wearing a heavy wooden ox yoke around his neck to physically demonstrate his dark warning. Accept the heavy yoke of Babylon and survive, or rebel and perish. On the opposing side, Hananiah and the proud nobles sold us the comforting lie that Egypt was our savior and Babylon would crumble within 2 years. I was there when Hananiah violently smashed Jeremiah's wooden yoke right inside the sacred temple, a wild symbolic act that drove the desperate crowds completely mad. Convinced that a glorious victory was guaranteed, King Zedekiah, the man meant to guide us, just froze in the middle of this terrible crossfire. He knew Babylonian spies watched our every move. But the intense pressure from his generals and the pharaoh's shiny military promises finally won him over. The ancient Lachish letters, you and I both know how fast fear spreads. Those broken pottery shards from Lachish reveal our suffocating panic. Entirely relying on distant fire signals to connect Judah's dying cities. During this agonizing time, Zedekiah caved. He shattered our sworn vassal treaty and completely stopped sending the required tribute gold to Babylon. If you believe a harsh truth is better than a sweet lie, comment below saying, the truth sets us free. Egypt promised us absolute protection, but Nebuchadnezzar was never a man to sit around while his enemies gathered strength. His brutal response was not diplomatic, but logistical. Before Pharaoh Apries could even march his forces up the coast, the massive Babylonian army was already suffocating Jerusalem with another terrifying siege. This time, there was no bargaining, no selective exile or replacing kings. Our city was locked tight. Nobody entered, nobody left, as our food supplies slowly vanished behind the stone walls. Zedekiah's guards stared at the horizon, desperately praying to see the dust from the promised Egyptian chariots. Help was supposedly coming, but it would bring one of the most agonizing disappointments in ancient military history. Suddenly, the impossible miracle actually happened. The deafening roar of heavy battering rams striking our gates and the endless rain of arrows just stopped. Our exhausted watchmen looked down from the walls and witnessed the unthinkable. The terrifying Babylonian forces were breaking down their camp, turning their backs and marching away. Dust on the horizon proved Pharaoh Apries had crossed the border. Nebuchadnezzar, refusing to fight a brutal war on 2 fronts, was forced to lift our agonizing siege and intercept the advancing Egyptian threat. Inside our starving city, sheer relief instantly exploded into wild euphoria. And King Zedekiah suddenly looked like a brilliant military savior for trusting that foreign Egyptian alliance. I watched our blind nobles cheering for war, foolishly boasting that God had shielded our holy Jerusalem once again. Only the prophet Jeremiah stayed deeply solemn. He warned us all, my heavy heart remembers his words, that this peace was a fleeting illusion. He swore wounded Babylonians would still return to burn our home to ash, but I ignored him. Picture this with me. I truly believed my nightmare was over, but the clash of these empires wasn't the epic salvation my Judah desperately prayed for. When Egypt's generals saw the terrifying scale and ruthless discipline of Nebuchadnezzar's forces marching toward them, they made a freezing, calculated choice that doomed us all. Saving my sacred city simply wasn't worth the heavy risk of destroying the Pharaoh's core army. Without firing a single arrow for us, Egypt turned their backs and retreated to the Nile. They left me utterly alone in my terror. Just as the prophet Ezekiel declared, Egypt was a splintered reed, a treacherous, broken crutch that violently pierces the bleeding hand of anyone begging for support. The Babylonians returning brought me sheer, paralyzing terror. They marched back with doubled wrath, utterly determined to erase my people from the earth forever. Their absolute siege in 587 before Christ completely suffocated my hope. Lamentations perfectly captures my darkest memories, agonizing starvation, where I watched my neighbor's frail skin cling tightly to brittle bones. When our massive walls finally shattered, I witnessed zero mercy. Solomon's glorious temple, my very identity and soul, was brutally looted and burned. King Zedekiah tried fleeing in the dark night, but I heard they captured him on the plains of Jericho. They forced our king to watch his sons slaughtered, before blinding him and dragging him in heavy chains to foreign Babylon. My beloved Jerusalem was nothing but a pile of smoking ash. The holy royal bloodline felt entirely severed from this weeping earth. Nebuchadnezzar crushed us and pacified the entire region. But a war of that magnitude costs tremendous wealth. He burned through vast fortunes moving violent troops, feeding soldiers, and building massive siege machines year after year. Babylon's empty treasury demanded immediate silver, and stealing my homeland's holy treasures, though deeply symbolic, could never cover his endless imperial debts. The greedy king urgently needed a wealthier target, a place where gold wasn't just sacred temple decor, but the very heartbeat of the global economy. And he knew exactly where to plunder that wealth. Tyre wasn't merely a city, it was a locked vault amidst the raging sea. Set on Lebanon's coast, this mighty Phoenician fortress was the ancient world's banking hub, boasting a terrifying, deeply frustrating geographic advantage against its bitter enemies. Its main heart thrived on an island, fully separated from the mainland by half a kilometer of deep water. Our captor arrived expecting a swift victory to pay for my city's destruction. But instead he crashed into a brutal, logistical nightmare spanning 13 long years. The historian Josephus, a Jewish scholar from the 1st century holding lost Phoenician records, firmly backs the completely absurd, agonizing duration of this monstrous military siege. This was no quick battle. It was a slow, punishing project of miserable military engineering, lacking a navy to blockade the port. Our oppressors desperately filled the sea, dumping endless tons of heavy stone and dirt into the violent waves to forge a road directly to the island. In Ezekiel chapter 29, the prophet vividly details the absolutely wretched, broken physical condition of those Babylonian troops. He writes how every single head was rubbed bald, and every exhausted shoulder rubbed completely raw. This agony came from heavy bronze helmets and the grueling forced labor of hauling jagged rubble for over a brutal decade beneath the blistering Mediterranean sun. When the battered city finally surrendered in 573 before Christ, Babylon's soldiers rushed the grand palaces and temples, starved for their long-awaited payout after profound suffering, but they found absolute emptiness. Across 13 endless years of brutal siege, Tyre's elite secretly used their untouchable e-merchant fleet, ships My. Captors couldn't intercept, to quietly evacuate their massive royal treasury and vast commercial wealth towards safer, distant colonies in North Africa. Nebuchadnezzar technically won his war, yet utterly broke his own army. He wasted vast fortunes merely conquering a worthless, empty rock. I heard the camp smelled of sheer mutiny. Desperate mercenaries never bleed for patriotism. They kill purely for plunder. If the violent king couldn't pay up, they'd butcher him, right in that crippling financial crisis. The prophet Ezekiel recorded a divine vision that drastically shifted our brutal enemies' entire military focus. The Holy Scriptures reveal that God saw Nebuchadnezzar and his exhausted army laboring tirelessly against Tyre, receiving absolutely zero wages for their sweat. Therefore, the Almighty himself would hand over the fertile lands of Egypt to pay their terrible wages. Suddenly, invading Egypt was no longer just a simple border defense strategy for this starving empire. It became a deeply desperate economic necessity. Let's look at this closely. Our Babylonian captor gripped a divine check. But to cash it, he had to march into a frantic nation facing total, absolute collapse. That very collapse sparked directly from a massive military mutiny deep within the Nile Delta, right in 568 before Christ. Pharaoh Apries, the exact coward who falsely promised to rescue my fallen Jerusalem, now faced the blazing, unstoppable fury of his own betrayed people. His own mercenaries violently turned on him, while his cunning general, Amasis, quickly hijacked the bloody chaos to steal the crumbling Egyptian crown. Have you watched empires fall? Egypt was tearing itself apart, brother slaughtering brother, leaving their mighty borders completely unguarded. To the Babylonian watchers who held us captive, this wasn't mere political news. It was the bloody signal they had craved for decades. Nebuchadnezzar, the monster who burned my home, was no longer a young desert prince. He was in the 37th year of his dark reign. He was an ancient ruler by our standards. But his unforgiving memory remained terrifyingly long. He knew an unstable Egypt was his golden chance to pay his massive army. Unknowingly fulfilling Ezekiel's holy prophecy, he launched his final, devastating military campaign. This time, his brutal ambition would not just stop at the Egyptian border. I watched his Babylonian troops march deep into African lands, exploiting the bitter civil war to loot, destroy, and utterly humiliate that ancient, prideful superpower. For many long years, later cynics doubted this brutal invasion even happened. The Egyptians, like any prideful nation desperate to keep their identity, never carved their humiliating defeats into stone. They just erased them. But the terrifying truth survived on a broken piece of clay, now held in a British museum. This clay tablet, catalogued as BM33041, is a shattered Babylonian relic. The ancient text is heavily damaged, which leaves us longing for more, yet the readable words remain chillingly clear. It clearly names the 37th year of Nebuchadnezzar, detailing his violent military march against Egypt and their false king, Amasis. It whispers of soldiers, horses, bloodshed. The text breaks off right before the final slaughter, like a terrifying vision fading before the climax. Still, the grim historical aftermath fills in this agonizing void. Since Egypt remained an independent kingdom, we know Nebuchadnezzar did not annex their land completely, like he cruelly did to my beloved Judah. He marched in, took his plunder, shattered their ancient pride, and walked away. It was a pure punishment expedition. A sudden, violent strike proving who now ruled this broken world. Pharaoh Amasis somehow survived on his throne, But the Egypt left bleeding from this invasion was just a trembling shadow of its former glorious past. They never again dared to expand their northern borders or challenge my Babylonian captors. They became exactly what our holy scriptures called a lowly, humbled kingdom. But our prophet Ezekiel spoke of a far deeper mystery. He foretold 40 bitter years of desolation. How do we explain a vision of total emptiness, haunting a nation where people still physically lived? The terrifying truth lies not in the dirt, but in the crushing weight of humiliation. Egypt did not simply turn into an empty wasteland of sand. Farms hugging the Nile still yielded wheat for survival. And their grand cities did not vanish from the ancient world map overnight. This creates an agonizing doubt for any lonely exile reading Ezekiel's sacred text today. Chapter 29 explicitly warns of 40 lonely years of desolation, claiming no foot of man or beast would ever pass through those lands. You and I might fear the prophecy failed. Yet, as captives living through it, we understood this desolation wasn't about ending mortal life. It was the absolute death of their pride and power, before the nightmare of Nebuchadnezzar arrived. Egypt was the commanding voice dictating Middle Eastern law, the deceptive shadow where desperate little kingdoms like my Judah falsely sought safety. After Babylon's army ravaged them, the bleeding nation curled into a defensive shell. They became exactly what our bleak prophecies warned, a profoundly humbled, broken kingdom. They stopped projecting their worldly power. No more Egyptian armies marched toward Syria. No grand naval fleets dared to control the Mediterranean trade routes again. Egypt vanished into a terrified international silence lasting decades. They existed merely to survive within, never again rising above the lonely nations as a dominating imperial superpower. We hold the heartbreaking physical proof of their crushed sovereignty and the bitter deportation of their elite, hidden beneath Babylonian ruins. Searchers eventually uncovered chilling administrative documents, now remembered in history as the Whitener Archives. These cold, bureaucratic texts record the meager daily rations of oil and food thrown to us foreign prisoners, trapped in this overwhelming capital city. And right alongside our names, I spot captive princes, broken artisans, shipbuilders, and fallen Egyptian nobles. It proves their grim exile happened. Nebuchadnezzar brutally ripped away Egypt's brightest minds, dragging them to serve his massive empire, exactly as he stole my Jewish people from Jerusalem years before. For ruthless Babylon, the outcome was perfect. Nebuchadnezzar never wanted to actually rule Egypt. It was too distant, too costly to control. He only wanted to shatter his enemies' legs, making sure they could never march away from home. By crippling the pharaoh, he ensured no one left in our promised land had a rich ally to fund rebellions. His dark mission was complete. This Babylonian king had defeated history's greatest civilization while wiping my beloved Judah completely off the map. He arrogantly believed his eternal legacy was secured in gold and stone. Yet, tell me the bitter irony, by destroying our sacred Jerusalem to consolidate his earthly might. Ever watch your entire world burn? Our captor unknowingly built the tool preserving our identity forever. King Nebuchadnezzar honestly believed that by burning my holy temple to ash, he murdered the God of Israel. He was so wrong. This terrifying Babylonian exile was meant to swallow my Jewish identity into pagan darkness. Instead, the crushing loneliness became a roaring furnace of holy purification for us. Stripped of our physical temple for sacrifices, with no promised land left to plant, my weeping people were forced to fiercely cling to something those Babylonian fires could never actually destroy. The sacred scrolls, sitting by those alien Babylonian rivers, weeping in the dust. We birthed the synagogue, that deep temptation of idolatry, the poison haunting Judah for generations, was finally washed from my grieving heart. The arrogant Babylonian king just wanted to erase my nation, yet he accidentally forged the religious bedrock keeping our Jewish faith alive for over 2,500 years. Meanwhile, the fate of Nebuchadnezzar's own arrogant empire proved to be violently short and undeniably cruel. All that blinding Babylonian glory, boasting lush hanging gardens and massive blue Ishtar gates, barely outlasted the fleeting lifespan of one mortal man. Just 23 agonizing years after the great, feared king finally died, in 539 before Christ, Persians swallowed our captive city without smashing a single wall, exactly as our holy prophets solemnly warned. The sacred gold stolen from my home in Jerusalem and Egypt changed hands again. That so-called eternal city began a bleeding, slow decay, rotting into a silent pile of forgotten ruins buried deep under the blowing sands of modern Iraq. Look at a map today. The historical irony hits hard. Egypt, the ancient superpower that felt invincible, lost all sovereignty and fell to the heavy rule of Persian kings, Greeks, Romans, and Arabs, reduced to a mere secondary kingdom. But Babylon, my grand oppressor, vanished completely, trapped forever inside dusty museums and history books. Yet my tiny sliver of land caught between sea and desert, our sacred promised land and the broken people Nebuchadnezzar desperately tried to slaughter, we are still breathing today. That blind tyrant honestly believed he was writing history's script. But he was merely a temporary tool. His ultimate life achievement wasn't building a massive pagan empire. His true historical legacy was becoming the painful spark that made my bruised, lonely faith absolutely unbreakable forever. We survived the fire. Now, click the video on your screen to uncover what daily life was actually like in those cities during Jesus' time. These are beautiful, ancient biblical traditions completely swallowed up by relentless time. Go ahead, click the video on your screen right now and witness it.